Chapter 12. One Against a Pack. The trip out of the mountains took the party well into the night, under a moon so bright that it made the crossing easy of the rocky foothill country. Slim, gentle Nell was carried for the most part by the foreman, while a badly shattered Reddy rode in a litter made from a coat stretched between 4 short poles that were tied together to form a rectangle. Bill, crestfallen and thoroughly ashamed, slunk in their wake, sniffing occasionally at the lion's skin which Johnny carried in addition to his corner of the litter. Under their snowshoes, the white blankets swished and crunched under the damp chill of the rarefied air, while overhead many stars twinkled. Far to the left, where there was a gully and cottonwood trees, coyotes yapped. Against the white expanse, the party looked very insignificant, but itself it felt important enough, and because of the elation of success, was able to keep up a good pace in spite of tired muscles. Little was said. Now and then Patricia tried to encourage the 2 injured hounds by petting them and talking to them, but for the most part each was busy with his thoughts and the expectation of food and rest at the ranch. It was nearly 11 when the scraping of their snowshoes on the porch boards heralded their return and brought a grand welcome. Miss Marshall had been so worried that for her sake the cowboys had remained at the ranch house on the chance that a search party would be needed, so there was a good crowd to jollify over the hunt and ask endless questions while the food and drink were being served and a roaring fire was built up in the big main room. The whole adventure was so astounding that without the tawny hide of the lion to prove the truth of the story, it would have been hard to convince the cowboys, who, however, when sure it was not all a joke, knew how to appreciate what Reddy had accomplished. It was they who insisted upon helping Johnny to disinfect the hound's wounds and make both Reddy and Nell comfortable as possible on the blankets laid out in front of the fire. Also, it was they who the next day rode into town and spread the colorful story which started Reddy's fame throughout the land. For here was news which won a front page space in papers far and wide, and later was taken up by one of the leading sports magazines in an illustrated feature story. The artist had used plenty of imagination and had depicted the mountain lion as about the size of a Bengal tiger in relation to the hound, which was stretching the lion's 9-foot length somewhat. But while the fame was spreading, Reddy was slowly recovering from the fight and being made ready for more adventure, for now he was in the limelight and looked upon as a public character in the same way as a racehorse that had won a big race. Someone made a bet that he could not kill a grizzly, someone else wanted to take him on a hunting trip to Africa, and a third suggested that he be the hero of a moving picture that would show the difficulties of an early American settler in defending his family and his livestock from wild beasts until he tamed a giant wolf, Reddy, who made short work of all of his enemies, including a few Indians. Johnny did not lose his head over all of this, although he came in for a good deal of notoriety himself, and had to tell again and again the story of Reddy and the king in the wilds of Alberta. Now he happened to reclaim the hound. The West liked heroes, and in Reddy it had a real one who seemed to have plenty of possibilities of continuing to win laurels. Of all of those in this exciting drama which centered on the ranch, the Marshalls were the most interested. They helped Johnny to answer letters, they took care of sightseers. The lion skin was tacked across one end of the living room, where all who came to see and admire it while being introduced to Reddy and the 2 black and tans, who quickly learned to enjoy visitors as much as anyone. There was no trouble now in keeping the road open, because the visitors could not be thwarted by mere snow. They came from neighboring ranches, for the most part, in packed cars, mother, father, and children, all in a holiday mood and prepared for a picnic. Mrs. Marshall was always offering them cakes, coffee, and milk, and they went away in happy humor, and sometimes came a second time or sent their friends. In winter, there was very little of interest in the sagebrush country, which accounted for much of this enthusiasm. Reddy accepted this all with calm and dignity. For several days he'd been unable to walk, but by the time visitors began to come, he could move about slowly and stiffly. Nell was in much the same state, but Bill, of course, was in fine trim and greeted everyone by capering about and wagging his tail, as if he was sure that he was the hero of the occasion. The winter was a hard one. There was so much snow that the cattle and horses could find very little food on the range, and had to be hand-fed at the corral from stacks of alfalfa hay. Even elk and antelope came to the corral, the former following the creek bed all the way from the mountains and spending the daytime hours among the cottonwoods. Several of the young and weaker animals were attacked, hamstrung and eaten by coyotes, which gathered together in a formidable gang of 18. This seemingly always hungry pack made the ranch its headquarters and spent much of each night in sneaking around the buildings to grab anything alive or dead that was edible and not formidable enough to protect itself. The pack haunted the cattle, the elk, and even the horses with the constant hope that it would find strays or one that seemed to be weakening. At first, Bill boldly chased the coyotes whenever he was let out after dark, but they soon cured him of this and taught him that it was safer to stay by the fireside. Their method was one of old time, of running from him until he was well away from any aid that might come from the ranch house, and then turning on him in a body and almost eating him up before he could rush back. The first time this happened, Bill was so cut up and in such a panic that he almost burst through the door when he came tearing to the porch, with 3 big coyotes snapping at his heels. The second time he was more wary and did not go so far, but he had to run for his life, and he was anything but a fighter. On still evenings, the yapping of the coyotes could be heard on all sides, even with the doors and windows closed at the ranch house. So there was trouble in controlling Reddy and Nell when they began to feel strong again. Bill had learned his lesson by now and just lay low. Toward the end of February, when the days were long enough to melt some of the snow in the sunniest places, Johnny came to the ranch from town where he'd been boarding and decided that both Reddy and Nell were fully recovered from their wounds and fit to be taken back to Alberta as soon as he was sure the roads were passable. He took them and Bill out for a walk and made a circle around one of the big buttes that rose like young mountains in the midst of the fairly level plain. On the southeast slope, the snow was well melted in places, and here Reddy began to nose about with interest, for scent lay well, and he had detected the track of coyotes. Nell followed his every step, and the two gradually worked around the butte until they came to a thicket of sagebrush. Here there was a sudden commotion, a wild baying, and then a rush over the snow as 2 coyotes burst out and streaked for their safety with the hounds ripping along almost at their heels. The coyotes gained at first, and then reached the next butte well ahead, but by this time Reddy had already outdistanced Bill and Nell, and was getting into his old stride so well that he was making the coyotes run fast enough to begin to tire. According to their usual habit, they separated, the larger of the 2 keeping to the edge of the slope, while the smaller ran toward a gully. Reddy followed the big one, who was trying to make time in a well-beaten elk path, but when the coyote tried to dodge among some rocks, he put forth his best spurt of speed and outguessed him at every turn and bowled him over in a wild leap across the snowbank. The coyote was so surprised that he had no time to get himself set for a real fight. Leaving him in the snow, Reddy rushed for the gully and took up the trail of the other, following unerringly until the coyote loomed ahead and soon turned with teeth bared for a fight rather than plunge any longer through the drifts. Reddy walked slowly around him as he crouched in a depression, snarling and making his worst face, before suddenly charging and almost getting Reddy's left hind leg. Until then, the hound had hesitated to go through with the fight, for he was not really angry at the coyote, and there was no one to tell him that he should do away with this killer of the plains. But now it was different, and Johnny, though far away, heard his roar and knew that there were only 16 coyotes left in the ranch pack. Johnny skinned both of the animals on the spot and brought the handsome, thickly furred pelts to the ranch house to be added to the collection of trophies. The marshals were pleased and greatly surprised. 2 coyotes in a day? Again, Reddy was petted and praised. That night, when the little wolves assembled as their usual and began their clamor, he wanted to be let out, and he bayed fiercely in answer to their challenge. But Johnny, who'd been invited to sleep at the ranch, wisely kept him indoors to rest and stay out of harm's way. Therefore, when bedtime came, Reddy was left, apparently safely, curled up in his corner with the black and tans. Scarcely, however, had the lights been put out when he was at the door sniffing and listening longingly. He knew now that the hand of man was against these coyotes, and some of his old hatred, fostered in his days with the king, returned to make him anxious to be out there in the snow hunting them down. While his sister and brother dozed, he walked around the long room, restless and alert, the hair on his back stiffening whenever he heard any sound outside. He tried to look out of the windows, and in one of these attempts found a sash that was not firmly closed. It rattled when he nosed it, and let in the cold night air. Reddy stood on his hind legs and scratched hard at the lower sash, without much result. Then he tried to push with his nose, and as a last resort, he worked it with his front teeth, gradually widening the opening until his nose could slip in, and he could thrust more and more of his body through, and eventually squirm out. He landed in the snow with nothing more between him and the job he wanted to finish. And again he was as free as in the old days. The whole world before him, the night clear and beautiful. But he was lonely without the black wolf, on whom he'd depended so often, and whom he could never forget. Just once he walked around the buildings. The loneliness got the upper hand, and he howled. It was the long, dismal wolf call which he gave, the one that the king always answered. But this time there was no answer, though the coyotes heard, and after some circling and indecision, bunched together and waited in the cottonwoods below the ranch, their sharp noses pointing in the direction from which had come the sound. The fight was inevitable. Reddy knew it, and the coyotes guessed it. To all of them, life had meant many fights. It had been hard and cruel and rough. And now with the hound moving around the ranch, the coyotes nervously watching from the cottonwoods, there was no real fear of fighting in itself, but a kind of awe of an enemy not yet tried out in battle. A reluctance to be the first to start the thing. The coyotes continued to watch, and the big hound continued to potter about, each side well aware of the other, and waiting for something to happen without bringing it about. Somewhere out in the moonlit expanse around them an elk snorted. From far away, almost out of earshot, came the yapping of a lone coyote. And still Reddy wandered about the buildings, and the tension just grew. Finally, Reddy picked an open place between the buildings and the cottonwoods, where no creature could slip up on him without being seen, and here he sat down calmly in the snow to outwait the enemy. The longer he sat there in plain view, the more nervous and reckless the coyotes became. They fidgeted about, trotted this way and that, and soon began to make cautious circles in order to satisfy their curiosity and see what the hound would do. Always in the back of their minds was the thought that even an enemy is good eating when the other food is scarce, and each one in the band fully expected it to be a kill for his share. They were lean, a ghostly lot, moving without a sound and growing bolder with each circle. The males in particular were full of confidence in their strength and agility. Gradually 5 of the males drew closer, each encouraging the other. Back of them, like shadows, the remainder trotted this way and that, their usual shifty eyes scarcely leaving the stolid figure of the hound. When they came too close, Reddy stood up and looked around, his hair bristling and his teeth bared. The coyotes retreated a few yards, and then one of their females began to yap and howl. And as if this was a signal, one of the males charged and grazed Reddy's flank with his teeth. Reddy whirled like lightning. Another charged and another, turning aside just in time to avoid the contact of the hound. They were trying him out, leading him on. A fourth tried it, not so expertly, and Reddy leapt to meet him. Teeth clashed against teeth, and the two coyotes charged from the rear and slashed at his legs. And then Reddy went wild, with all the fury that was in him. A dozen coyotes dashed in, and with teeth flashing, he charged first one and then another, and roared with rage as the swarm eluded him, and yet caught his flanks again and again. One skidded in, making a turn, and Reddy had him in an instant, hurling him to the snow and boring into his thick, furry-furred neck until he had a right grip and shook him as if he were a rat. Turning as though on a pivot, he pinned another and shook him, and sprang over his body to reach a third. Coyotes seemed everywhere, snarling, slashing, and leaping away, mad with the smell of blood and battle. Reddy tripped over their bodies and flung them from him, ripped and chewed and roared. He was not in condition for a fight like this. His tongue soon began to hang out. He gasped for breath and swallowed blood and hair, but he fought. If only the king were there. Back to back, he and Reddy could have stood and beaten an army of coyotes. But the black wolf was not with him, and Reddy was weakening. Tottering from exhaustion, he held the closing ring at bay, the relentless hungry wolves, and the plains, the killers, every one, coming in now for a final round. Reddy was very quiet. His feet were wide apart, bracing for the impact of the surging bodies. Though his breath came in long gasps, there was a disdain in the way his upper lip curled. The coyotes, balancing stiff-legged on their toes, snarled almost in his face, but they held back from the range of his teeth, well known that he was terribly dangerous to the end. Soon there would be a rush by all together, and at least one of them would meet those teeth, but which one? They hesitated, and Reddy waited, watchful, grim, and determined. A streak of fire, followed instantly by a tremendous explosion, seemed to paralyze the world. 2 coyotes dropped in the snow and began to kick crazily. The others scattered in panic. There were voices, and people running from behind the ranch buildings. Johnny, carrying the gun, ran to Reddy's side and leaned over him, calling for a light. Marshall, the foreman, Patricia, and Bob clustered around him, and Reddy looked up at them and wagged his tail. Around the group ran Nell, baying wildly, while Bill slunk on the outskirts of the crowd. "Look at the wolves!" shouted Bob, pointing to the gray bodies lying about him. He began to hunt them out and count. 5, 6, 7. "Look out, there's one getting away!" By the light of the moon, Johnny shot again and laid low this badly wounded cripple. "That's 8, yelled Bob. "Yow, 8 of them! That's a whole pack!" "The place looks like a drove yard," exclaimed Marshall. "See all the tracks in the trampled snow?" "Give me a hand," pleaded Johnny. "Quick, Reddy's all cut up. We'll carry him in." It took Johnny and the foreman, with Marshall assisting, and Patricia carrying the flashlight, to get Reddy to the ranch house and lay him once more on blankets in front of the fireplace. He was bleeding from more than a dozen gashes, but as Marshall remarked to cheer up the party, "He'll live. He always does. But what'll he be up to next?" They worked over Reddy and sat around for a time to talk about this latest exploit of his. The score for 24 hours was 10 coyotes, a record if ever there was one. Patricia came in for a well-deserved praise, for it was she who had heard the noises of the battle and run through the house spreading the alarm. Marshall had given Johnny his 10-gauge duck gun, and Johnny had slipped out quickly ahead of the others and stealthily approached the busy coyotes without being seen. In the excitement of the moment, he'd fired both barrels at once and had almost been knocked down by the recoil. "I say," exclaimed Bob suddenly, "you look awfully funny, Pat." It was certainly true. In her rush to save Reddy, Patricia had put on one black boot, one tan boot, and wrapped herself in a pink quilt in the place of a coat. "We all look sort of particular," suggested her father, glancing at his own costume. And with that, they one and all bolted for the hallway and hurried back to bed. End of chapter 12.